Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. Another weekly reset for the War Within expansion brings in a ton of more class tuning and adjustments, most of which are based on the class performance from this week's within heroic as well as mythic raiding and dungeon content, but also within the current PvP season so far. And this week we actually see some substantial increases for a handful of playstyles, with Mages probably taking home the biggest amount of updates, which is, I feel right now, is becoming a pretty common thing, with Mages getting so much attention, not only during the development of Alpha and Beta, but still continuing into the irregular updates for the live launch of Season 1 content. As always, chapter marks down below, and it's a pretty long video, so I want to get into it as soon as possible. But right before that, if you want to see more regular War Within updates like these, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. Otherwise, let's dive right into this set of class adjustments. Starting off, we have the class of Death Knight, which for PvE content isn't seeing a lot of changes. We're just seeing an adjustment to Trollbane's Icy Fury ability, primarily the slowing effect that he provides. So I guess in PvE content, specifically Mythic Plus Dungeons, that control is getting lessened slightly, but there's plenty of other classes and plenty of other ways the Death Knights can enact slows within PvE content. However, for PvP, your control is further lessened by nerfing slightly the PvP talent of Doomburst, which now reduces how many more festering wounds your Death Coils can pop. You already have a baseline popping of festering wounds with Death Coils through Sudden Doom natively, but Doomburst provide you a little bit of burst, but also a movement speed reduction on your foes as well. So for Unholy Death Knights within PvP, you are seeing some reductions in the control department specifically. Demon Hunters, we're not seeing a lot of changes for raids and dungeons, but we are seeing some adjustments for PvP in order to help out their, I guess you could say, dwindling participation numbers within solo content, rated content, PvP content in general. There's just not a lot of Demon Hunters running around, so they're trying to give them a bit of a leg up this time around. Your baseline generators for Fury, such as your Demon's Bite or your Demon's Blade, all of those are seeing about a 10% damage increase within PvP combat, as well as the most basic of basic combat abilities are also being amped up. The ability of Chaos Strike as well as Annihilation are seeing a 10% damage increase, while Blade Dance is seeing a 10% damage increase together with its demonic counterpart of Death Sweep as well. So basically 10% damage across the board for all of your basic combat abilities may be enough to help Demon Hunters have a bit more of a bite in their damage, but hard to tell if this is going to be impactful enough because it doesn't attack things such as the mobility or survivability. From there, we got the class of Druid, and for PvE content, we're not seeing too many adjustments. For Feral Druids, they are seeing a quality of life adjustment though with Rampant Ferocity. Normally, when you use the Ferocious Bite, your rip damage and AoE damage is determined around the target of your bite, which can make positioning around enemies a little bit awkward. So let's say you got all these targets blown up in AoE, and you're biting this far left target over here, the AoE effect would actually come from that target instead. So maybe like an enemy over here or anybody further out beyond 8 yards actually would not be taking any damage from this AoE effect. But they're changing Rampant Ferocity, so instead of radiating from the target, it now radiates from the feral. So you can now make some little micro adjustments to make sure that everybody with a bleed makes sure they get cleaved. This is a pretty nice update, mostly a quality of life adjustment, but it should hopefully improve on the ability for Feral Druids to control which targets get AoE'd and have a little bit more micromanagement going forward. Besides this, however, Restoration Druids are seeing a 4% healing increase overall. This 4% healing increase only applies for PvE content, but not for PvP. Though in PvP, however, we are seeing further adjustments to the Feral Druid specifically. It looks like as of this update, Feral Druids are going to be changed where they're going to have a little bit less power in their bites, but a little bit more power is going to be transferred over into their bleeds, since, as we've seen a couple of times on this channel already, Feral Druids' burst can be actually kind of out of control a bit. So certain talents are going to be adjusted a little bit to take away power from bites into those bleeds, specifically through talents such as Sabertooth, which will increase your bite damage by 10% instead of 15% within PvP, and increases the bite damage additionally per periodic effect by 2% instead of 3%. The talent Tasteful Blood is actually seeing a pretty hefty reduction, increasing bites damage by 6% instead of 12% within PvP. Though the damage of your Rip ability is now being increased by 25%, up from its original increase of 15%, so like a 10% damage increase, but also the damage of your Rake is being substantially substantially increased as well, by 25% for its initial damage up from 15, and by its periodic damage by 10% instead of negative 6% modifier, so like a 60% bleed increase within PvP combat, which seems kind of huge. From there, we have the class of the Evoker, where all we're seeing for Devastation specifically is just a PvP adjustment. Like, their ability of Eternity Surge is seeing a 15% damage reduction within PvP, which is just simply going to hit on their overall burst and cleave capabilities, but not too big of a change besides that. Now, a class that's seeing some much needed changes is actually going to be the Beast Mastery Hunter. For BM Hunters, we've seen them do decent single target damage, relatively speaking, but not that great of AoE damage, so they're seeing an improvement in that regard specifically, primarily through two talents such as Beast Cleave, which is now going to be increased to 90% cleave damage instead of 80% cleave damage, which should hopefully make the pets a little bit more stronger, a little bit more effective when it comes to the overall damage. But also the Kill Cleave talent is being updated as well. In the same way as Beast Cleave is being buffed up to be 90% damage increase, Kill Cleave is also going to have its damage increased to 90% instead of 80% of its current value, which is definitely a welcome adjustment because BM Hunter AoE damage has been a little bit of a downslope as of recently. Now, the next class seeing some significant adjustments will be the Mage, with a ton of buffs coming to the specs of Fire, Frost, as well as a bunch of PvP adjustments. First of all, with a spec such as Fire, we're seeing further improvements when it comes to the AoE department. Abilities such as Flame Strike are being further increased by 15%, which is a significant and should hopefully help some of the Flame Strike builds to be a little bit more effective. The ability of Phoenix Flames itself is being amped up by 20%, being a fairly fantastic ability when it comes to cleave damage. But they also further buffed Living Bomb by 10%. Now, Living Bomb is an ability that was so fun to play around with during the early alpha and the beta periods, and I'm actually very sad, and I think it's kind of criminal, that none of you guys are playing on live right now have been able to enjoy Living Bomb in its full glory during those days. Living Bomb was such a fun talent, and there's 8 talent points to spend into buffing up the damage of Living Bomb, and all those talents have been used since they started to adjust Living Bomb. I think it was a big overcorrection for this ability. So over the last few weeks, we've seen him juicing it and juicing it and juicing it and juicing it again and again and again. And I guess the question is, at what point does Living Bomb become a fairly viable option? Hopefully soon. Hopefully they'll bring it back so you could actually play a proper Living Bomb build, but those bomb builds apparently were a little bit too strong for the beta and the alpha. Definitely couldn't make it into live, but I think it's still criminal that so many of you guys will not be able to play the good version of Living Bomb, and just because it hasn't really been a viable, proper, available option since I think the release of War Within so far. So maybe one day they'll get it right, but as of right now, I don't know. Is this going to be enough? It's really hard to tell. And the other spec of Mages is receiving even more buffs. I don't have my talent set up for this guy, but your Ray of Frost for Frost is being amped up by 15% within PvE and PvP content, so that makes talents such as Cryopathy and potentially Splintering Ray maybe a little bit better. Another one that's also getting amped up is Glacial Spike, only for dungeons and raids, not PvP content, but that one's getting amped up by 20%. So a fairly sizable ability plus another major cooldown are both being amplified by quite a bit, which should hopefully make Frost and Fire more competitive to the spec of Arcane. Further on though, we have even more PvP adjustments over in this upcoming update, specifically starting with the Frostfire spec. First of all, the Frostfire Bolt ability is being amped by quite a bit. Frostfire Bolt damage is being increased by 100% in PvP, up from an earlier increase of 75%, so plus 25% more damage on this ability. However, the Frostfire Empowerment effect that boosts the damage of that ability, making it 100% crit and giving it even more damage, that burst damage is being reduced to a 30% increase rather than initially a 50% increase within PvP. So a little bit more consistent damage out of Frostfire Bolt if you're spamming it, but a little bit less burst and random proc damage for this ability. So a bit of a trade with more sustained over burst. This is maybe going to benefit Frost Mages if you're going for a Frostfire build or a Frostbolt build, but with Frostfire replacing a Frostbolt. But I think this helps out Fire Mages more with that Tinder-based gameplay where they can fire off a quick fireball. Instead of making a fireball, it could be a Frostfire Bolt, which gets a bit more value there. In PvP, we are seeing even more spec-specific changes though with the Arcane Mages. Basic abilities such as Arcane Blast is being amplified from a 15% PvP gain to a plus 45% more damage, so you're looking at a pretty hefty increase there. Arcane Missiles are buffed by 20% and Arcane Barrage is buffed by 15%, so they're improving on some of the most basic gameplay and abilities for the spec of Arcane Mage. But where's the twist? The twist is the Magi's Spark burst damage is now being reduced to be 50% effective within PvP combat. So your basic abilities are being increased, which I think is good if you could play around that type of gameplay like missiles and barrages and the little bit of gameplay in between of burst. But your burst is being reduced a little bit, so I guess you're going to be less of just like one hit, one punch type of a class, but rather a more sustained base class, which can benefit Arcane Mages to some degree. Then we have the spec of Fire, where we're seeing the ability of Fireball damage increased by 100% in PvP, up from a 35% previous increase. So sizable damage increase to ability of Fireball, but if you're playing Frostfire, I guess you still have access to Fireball. No, you don't. No, you don't, because Frost Fireball then replaces your Fireball. Does that mean that Frost Firebolt can double dip into both the buffs for Frostfire and Fireball? Or are those two abilities on a separate, like, modifiers? And this potentially could be huge for Frostfire Bolt if it's replacing, I guess it says here that it replaces Frostbolt instead of Fireball, but your Fireball ability is gone out of his spell book when you have Frostfire Bolt, and it's actually replacing a Fireball instead, so I'm a little bit confused there. But for Fire Mage, whether you play in the Frostfire playstyle or if you're playing the Sunfury build, Frostfire Bolt and Fireball both are being increased by 100% within PvP. And the Fireball is being amped up, then I think the talent of Glass Cannon could potentially be really good, which further increases the damage of Fireball, Scorch, and Ignite by 30%. Even though it decreases your overall health, it could give you a little bit of a bursty setup that you can use once every so often. Besides this, the PvP talent of Greater Pyroblast is also being adjusted, reducing its cast time from a 4.5 seconds down to a 4-second cast time, but it will now deal 30% of the target's max health instead of 35, so a slightly faster cast but not as big of a hit. Finally, we have some PvP changes for the spec of Frost Mage. First of all, your Ice Lane's damage is being reduced from a 45% PvP increase down to a 25% PvP increase. It is still increased, just not by as big of a value. Another ability is being buffed up is your Frostbolt, which can be replaced with Frostfire, which is increased by 150% within PvP instead of 118% PvP. Again, another question, is the Frostfire buff affecting Frostfire Bolt, or are the two abilities just a separate entity? I guess time will tell and somebody will be able to do some testing, but there could be potential for some overlap and double dipping, or possibly not. Besides this, in PvP, Ray of Frost sees another 5% damage increase within PvP. However, your defenses of your Ice Barrier are being slightly reduced. They're actually reducing the absorb of in PvP. It has been decreased by 40% instead of initial value of 25%. So it's not quite a 40% nerf, but still is a nerf from the original reduction of 25% that we saw before. Next, we have the class of Monk, which is seeing mostly PvP adjustments, specifically for the spec of Mistweaver. As a Mistweaver, we're seeing some single target healing increases for PvP content, such as Envelop Mist is seeing its healing increase by 20%, as well as Vivify's priority healing further increased by 20%. So if you're struggling to top your allies in order to give them as much healing as possible, now you might be able to combine both of these abilities together and then funnel a ton of healing into that target. Next, we get the spec of Holy Paladin, where we're primarily seeing some new PvP adjustments for Holy Paladins. Primarily when it comes to some of those things like mana regeneration, which is actually being improved. The mana regen is being adjusted to be, instead of reduced by 35%, it is now only reduced by 40%. So a little bit more mana within PvP combat. Then some of your most basic healing abilities like Holy Shock buffed by 15%, Word of Glory buffed by 15% as well, which I imagine should also apply for Eternal Flame also, which makes Herald of the Sun builds a little bit better. And also your Holy Light, your very basic healing ability, also amped up by 20%. The Holy Light can be synergized together with Hand of Divinity, or better yet, Divine Favor, in order to get a little bit more value out of both of those heals. So basically, single target healing improvements for Holy Paladin for PvP content. From there, we have the class of Priest, where we've seen a number of changes, particularly when it comes to Shadow Priests within dungeons and raids, where they're not necessarily getting anything new in specifically, but 4% more overall damage within PvE content, which is one of those little gains that isn't going to be consequential in talent changes or build adjustments, but it's one of those changes that everybody is always going to happily take. Though as for PvP content, we are seeing some spec changes, however, as starting with the Disc Priest talent of Wheel and Woe, where we received the bonus amp to Power Word Shield, reduced to 50% overall effectiveness within PvP combat. And I have noticed that Disc Priest shields have actually been kind of beefy, so Wheel of Woe is going to be less effective when it comes to buffing up the power of Power Word Shield. Holy Priests, on the other hand, did find themselves in a bit of a slump when it comes to PvP content, and their representation so far, at least in solo rated content, isn't as high as it could be. So they're seeing a bit of a leg up this week. Both Holy Word Serenity as well as Holy Word Sanctify are being buffed up by 40% within PvP, which should hopefully make both of these major abilities a little bit more impactful, giving Holy Priests a little bit more burst heal potential. And while the burst of Holy Priest is being buffed up, the burst of Shadow Priest is being nerfed a little bit, specifically when playing as Archon with Perfected Form talent. Perfected Form will now increase the damage bonus during Void Form by 10% in PvP instead of 20%, so a bit of a reduction on that front specifically. And last, we have some minor adjustments for Subtlety rogues within PvP content. Specifically to the talent that is no longer on this talent tree, but the initial Echo and Reprimand ability. Echo and Reprimand, together with the talent of Reverberation will increase the damage of Echo and Reprimand by up to 100% baseline. Though that was previously reduced to 70% in PvP content, that reduction is now being amped up further to be 50% effective within PvP. This is primarily because Subtlety has a number of tools that it can use to combine with the damage of that Echo and Reprimand, particularly talents such as the Rotten, which can actually make your next two combo point generating abilities, including Echo and Reprimand, deal additional damage and be a guaranteed critical strike, which gives that ability a ton of consistency and a ton of burst potential. But with that, that's going to be the entirety of all the different class changes arriving next weekly reset, Tuesday for NA, Wednesday for EU in the War Within Season 1. And as always, I want to thank all of you so much for watching this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate that. Join our Discord community to discuss all of these upcoming updates with the rest of the channel community. Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.